We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. I'm your host, Will Hall, and Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center. Freedom Center is a support, activism, and advocacy community run by and for people who are diagnosed with severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar, depression, OCD, borderline personality. You can check out more information about Freedom Center on our website, which is freedom-center.org. We are also co-produced by the Icarus Project, is international community of people who are living with psychiatric labels but don't identify with the medical definition of our experience. Check out theicarusproject.net. My guest today is schizophrenia survivor and recovery advocate Ed Knight. Ed is known internationally for his work and leadership in transforming the mental health system. I'll just read his bio here, brief bio on Edward Knight, PhD. Dr. Ed Knight is Vice President for Recovery, Rehabilitation, and Mutual Support for Valueoptions. Valueoptions is the second largest behavioral managed care company in the U.S. He also serves as an adjunct professor of rehabilitation sciences at Boston University. Dr. Knight worked as a private consultant working through a consulting group called the Empowerment Partners from 1997 to 2001. His customers were managed behavioral health organizations, states and counties, as well as mental health provider and consumer organizations. He was the CEO of the Mental Health Empowerment Project, Inc. for 12 years. When that project began in 1988, there were about 12 self-help groups in New York State for mental health recipients. Now, in large part because of the project, there are over 600 self-help groups in New York State. The project also helped start or gave technical assistance to about 35 self-help not-for-profits efficiently delivering effective mental health services, including drop-in centers, peer counseling, housing, case management, and mutual support. Dr. Knight is also involved in research. He has worked with several research centers, UCLA, Boston University, Nathan Klein Institute in upstate New York, and National Research and Development Institutes in New York City. His areas of research interest are mutual support, recovery, rehabilitation, and co-occurring substance abuse and mental illness. Dr. Knight has received numerous awards, including the Clifford Beers Award from NMHA in 1992, the Timothy J. Coakley Leadership Award from American College of Mental Health Administration in 2004, and most recently the USPRA Chairperson's Award in 2005. Dr. Knight is a consumer of mental health services. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1969 and has been homeless. He is also a family member with members of his family of origin having had mental illness. Ed, thanks so much for joining us today on the show.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
You're going to be out here, I guess, on Thursday for a couple of events.
Yeah.
One is going to be a dialogue on empowerment with providers and consumer survivors at 1 to 2:30 at the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Partnership, which is in Holyoke. And then the other is at 3:30 at the Quaker Space, 43 Center Street in Northampton. People who are interested in that can get more information on our website, which is freedom-center.org.
Yes, and there'll be an event in the morning at the partnership for providers.
Oh, great. Okay. Just Ed, tell us a little bit about how did you get involved with this? I mean, I know you're an internationally recognized speaker on recovery, but what's sort of the background and history of your own story? I know you've been in the mental health system yourself.
Well, I was locked up and went through a recovery experience. It was a combination of I don't know, combination. That's a bad term already. It was a spiritual experience, and it was a spark, and it was grace, as described by Pat Deegan in her article, "Recovery: The Lived Experience of Rehabilitation." Except it was, unique to me. It wasn't Pat Deegan's experience; it was my experience, and I was suicidal. I was looking for a way out of my pain. The pain was so intense, I didn't really want to die. I just wanted the pain to stop because it was too intense to bear. And I was walking down the hall, and I stopped and I prayed probably the first authentic prayer that I prayed, and it was not to an image or to a concept. I simply prayed help, and the pain. I decided to see if the prayer would be answered. So there was an element of trust that there would be an answer, and I went back and laid on my bunk and fell asleep and slept through the night. And I woke up the next morning, and the pain had gone down enough that I could function. I know I could do things. The pain hadn't totally gone away though, and shortly thereafter, I was on a back ward, what they call a back ward, and I looked around, and we were all considered totally hopeless people. And the word recovery wasn't around. There was no possibility of such a thing. This was 1982. It was pre-recovery days, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make another point about the recovery story though, because we were all considered hopeless, and I decided at that point that wasn't fair, and that I was going to create hope, and it wasn't going to be just for me, and so hope came as a decision. It wasn't something to be discovered out in Dumdar Hills. You know what I mean? It was a decision to live my life on behalf of my brothers and sisters, and it was not some kind of mysterious thing that I was in quest of. And I think one of the things that is missing nowadays in the whole quest for hope is that it's a decision. So that's how I got into this kind of work. And then I didn't immediately. In the hospital, I started doing self-help work and began just. I didn't really get a job doing this kind of stuff until 88. So it was 82 to 86 years later. But for 6 years, I just helped whoever I could, doing whatever I could. I remember I was involved in several law cases, and just voluntarily, and started a number of self-help groups, and we finally began getting some funding streams in the area of self-help, and I saw a job and I applied for it. I was homeless at the time. My wife and I were homeless, and I was living in New York, and I applied for a job in Albany, and I got it, and I began organizing, and I was successful organizer. I had been trained as an organizer on the west side of Chicago, and by the Institute of Cultural Affairs, and so I used my organizing talents that I had learned in poverty situations with mental health situations, which are also poverty situations. That's often overlooked, I think. And the same kinds of strategies that are used in organizing work, and we applied those in New York State, and we went from about 10 self-help groups in 88 to when I left New York in 96, there were over 600 mutual support groups. And we had started at that point maybe 50 or 60 consumer survivor-run agencies. And we had successfully I had a lobbying effort which brought $280 million from the downsizing of mental hospitals into the community, and 5% of that, because we were at the table as a part of the lobbying effort, 5% of that off the top went to consumer survivor organizations. The experience leading up to my hospitalizations were ones of complete disorientation. I was a college professor and had a series of crises. I was disoriented in the classroom in front of my students, doing odd things, bizarre things. I lost my position as the college professor. I finished my dissertation shortly after that, and then shortly after that ended up homeless and lost everything that I had. I was homeless and destitute for a period of time. I was in and out of jails committing petty survival crimes for a period of time. I was disoriented, not knowing who I was, experiencing states of inner terror, which other people had no idea were going on. They didn't understand what they were. I couldn't relate to other people what they were. I had no idea what they were. There were extremely bizarre states of being that I was in that are very hard to articulate in words, and the experiences of loss were intense. And then I was finally picked up and put in a hospital. And when I was in the hospital, I saw brutality that I hadn't imagined would go on. I saw a friend of mine taken down by AIDS, and he was kicked in the head simply for talking loud, and he was then deaf in one ear from that. I saw another friend of mine who was beaten until he was a brilliant chess player, and after that he couldn't play chess because he had brain damage. I saw people selling sexual favors for a pack of cigarettes to people they didn't want to sell sexual favors to. I just saw things that were not very healing in a place that was supposed to be healing.
And this was in a public facility in Colorado?
No, this was in a public facility, but I'd rather not say where.
Yeah, I understand. Wow, and then that was several years that you were locked up and in that system.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was, I've talked to my brothers and sisters since then, and for example, in the state of New York when I was there, we had a study done by Commission on Quality of Care, and we found out that something like 60 or 70% of the population that were asked from state hospitals reported abuse, and about 10% of them reported sexual abuse. We had a report that was done by the department, the internal quality department at the Office of Mental Health in the state of New York, that issued a final report in which it stated that there was a culture of violence among the staff in the state hospitals in the state of New York. And there is a series of lawsuits currently against the state of New York, which would confirm that those kinds of things still go on. So I don't think that. Every year you read about reports in which people die during the seclusion and restraint process in institutions across America. There is and I don't want to. I mentioned the state of New York because it's publicly documented, but there are places. I'm not going to name names and places, but there's a practice called tubing, which was mentioned in a famous film shown in a famous film called Titicut Follies, and that film is horrendous in its detail of brutality. But tubing is holding somebody down who won't take their medication, shoving a tube down their throat and dropping a pill down their throat. People die in that process, and tubing is still going on in at least one institution that I know of in America. And practices like that need to be stopped. I know I was asked by a consumer survivor. Consumers call themselves consumers because they hold up the ideal of choice as an ideal and wish to choose their services, although feel a lot of times subject to force. And survivors call themselves survivors because they feel like they have survived through a very traumatic system, and then a lot of people call themselves consumer survivors and combine those terms. And a consumer survivor who works at the institution where tubing goes on is working very diligently to try to stop that practice. It's just horrendous, some of the things that go on. So all of that combined was the pain I was in. It was my pain from the losses. It was my pain from the internal chaos I was in. And I got to say this also, which is often ignored in mental illness. Some of the pain I was in was due to my own behavior. It was due to not the bizarre behavior, but due to some of the ways in which I had treated people, and I think that is often overlooked. In mental health, there is talk of triggers, and I'm my own worst trigger. I do 12-step work, and I think that there's a famous line. In 1,000 ways we act from fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity. We step on people's toes and they retaliate. Well, we often forget everything except they retaliate. We forget how we step on people's toes. Well, I think I'm my own worst trigger, so I'm willing to admit that I step on people's toes, that I act out of fear a lot, and that I act out of self-delusion and self-seeking and self-pity. So I do want to own my own stuff and not blame the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's one of the sides of activism for human rights is that the focus on changing the system. And just like you say, the states that we get into themselves are extremely difficult and extremely problematic, and they can be the things that lead us to be alienated from the people around us or get us into trouble with the police or lead us to homelessness. And all of this, eventually you ended up with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it was really that moment when you decided to take a spiritual approach to what was happening to you, that things really started to turn around. And why is it that you think you were able to make that step after all that you had been through? And what is it that really made a difference for you? Was there something that happened, or was it something that you were holding on to, or?
You mean that taking a spiritual step?
Yeah, that moment that you described of just praying in a really authentic way and then deciding to want to turn around and offer that hope to other people.
Well, it was a moment of being at. I mean, I was fractured. I was in a million pieces, and what happened was, I in that moment of asking for help, I don't know how to put this exactly, but I was at one with the million pieces, and then a couple days later, when I made the decision to help my brothers and sisters who were also fractured and in a lot of pain, I was at one with them. It was just the spirituality is not separate from where we are, and when I prayed and when I decided to help my brothers and sisters, I also made the decision to live right where I was. I made the decision to live in that institution and not really seek to get out. It was to live fully where I was, to live fully in the institution, in spite of the brutality around me. And it wasn't really. I decided to. I mean, this may seem strange and very paradoxical, because I could see the brutality around me. It was not to really resist or hate or it was to do something about it by seeing that the little man who works on the ward, the worker, was also somebody who was oppressed, and that the psychologist in charge of the ward was frightened, and that he had to come to work in a place that he thought was horrible, and that the kitchen staff didn't know what to do because they really had crappy food to prepare, and that the guy who was paying taxes and wasn't really paying enough taxes to support the institution at a level it needed to be supported at was strapped because he had kids at home, and his kids maybe didn't have proper dental care, and so he was trying to keep his taxes down. That the whole thing was broken, and I was like there in the middle of all that brokenness, trying to do something about it, trying to say, folks, we can heal. We don't need to be a burden on the state. We don't need to be hopeless and helpless. We can learn skills. We can set goals. And at that time, nobody was saying that. Nobody at all was saying that. That I could. I mean, later on, I found out people were saying that in different places, but there was no public voice saying that. Later on, I learned, that Judy Chamberlain was saying that, and that Joe Rogers was saying that, and Jay Mahler was saying that, and George Ebert was saying that, and David Oakes was saying that. Later on, I learned there were activists all over the country, but at that time, I didn't know all that. And so it was like there were people all over the country discovering that hope was possible and making decisions that hope was possible, and acting and trying to do something about their situations and the situations of everybody around them, and trying to function with compassion in the broken situations they were in, and that produced a movement. And what we have in this country is a strong movement at this point of consumers and survivors who have joined together, and we call ourselves consumer survivors at this point.
And you mentioned that you had some training as a community organizer. How did you put those skills to use, and how did you organize these support groups and get groups going around New York and around the country?
Well, there are really strategies for doing that. The basic strategy is to demonstrate in yourself and then in a particular geographical location that this can be done. So I think changing yourself, change begins with yourself, I think, and then changing a particular place, having a project in which you help your brothers and sisters engage in change, and that means creating hope, changing another strategy is changing stories, so that people. There's a term that I like, being restoried, gaining a new story, going from a story of hopelessness to a story of hope. That a whole group of people make a decision to hope and then begin to live out of that decision, and live with the brokenness of their situation, and be at one with the brokenness of their situation. There's a Zen kind of principle that when you're at one with brokenness, there's wholeness, or in the great death, there's the great rebirth. And so when there's a happening like that in one geographical location, that intensive strategy can be spread, and then you have an extensive strategy. You begin to spread the word. And so in New York, we began with the 10 self-help groups we had, and we used that as the basis for an extensive strategy, and we began to spread the word. And we went out and said, what can we do about our situation? There's 10 groups that are doing something. So we had what we called town meetings for empowerment, and we asked the questions: what can we do? What are the basic problems we face before, during, and after hospitalization, and what can we do about them ourselves? And we ended up with a common agenda across the state of New York. And from that, people began creating projects in all over the state. And then we had the Reinvestment Act, and the Reinvestment Act poured millions of dollars into the community, and actually millions of dollars into consumer survivor-operated projects. And we ended up in New York with a lot of change stories, and actually Inside Outside, Pat Deegan's DVD on moving from institutions into the community tells a lot of stories. Those stories are all from New York, and they're really some beautiful stories, but the Reinvestment Act and the funding allowed a lot of consumer survivor organizations to emerge, which are doing case management, homeless outreach, 3 different projects are doing supported housing. There's a lot of recovery centers. There's one place that does like a food pantry. There are a lot of support groups. There are skills teaching projects. There are just a lot of consumer survivor operated services all over the state of New York. And the other strategy besides intensive, extensive strategies and change story are research and development. You research what you've done. You keep account of what you've done in terms of research, and then you develop new ideas. You constantly need to be developing new ideas in order to grow and expand.
On that note, what's the role of medication in this whole issue? Because one of the things that we have focused a lot on at the Freedom Center, we've had a number of guests on this show. Robert Whitaker and Peter Stotsny was on last week, are really trying to bring forth the voices and the studies of the scientists and the professionals who are saying that the drugs that the pharmaceutical companies are really pushing really don't work the way that they say that they do, that there actually can be a big obstacle for a lot of people in recovery, and that there isn't a lot of accurate information, and that actually people can recover. Not only can people recover without medication, but actually if you start out with responding to a psychotic crisis or a breakdown or whatever it is with non-medication approaches, if you don't use medication to begin with, the outcomes are a lot better. So what in your view is the role of challenging kind of the centrality of pills and medication and the pharmaceutical companies in this whole movement that you're describing?
Well, I tried that approach, Will, and it didn't work for me. Peter Stotsny is an old friend of mine. I worked with Peter for a number of years. I have great respect for Peter. And I do know a number of people who have successfully gotten off medication. But for me, that hasn't worked.
You mean in your own personal life?
Yes, in my personal life.
But I mean, in general, as a movement approach, because one of the things that we do at the Freedom Center is there are many people who take medication who are at the Freedom Center, many people who don't. The idea is that, you present people with a choice and you give people options. But in terms of reforming the system as a whole, so that there are non-medication options and non-medication ways to deal with people's crisis.
Well, I think that medication is a complex question. I myself rely as much on meditation, meditation.
Yeah.
I rely as much on meditation as I do on medication. And I take medication for a number of different conditions other than psychiatric conditions, and they interact, and they don't always interact in helpful ways. So I'm somebody who tries to reduce the number of medications I'm on for all of the conditions I have. For example, I have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I smoked until 1993, and then I quit. And then I developed COPD 10 years later, which was, I'm my own worst trigger. I screwed up my lungs. But I actually work with a really good respiratory doctor in Denver at National Jewish Medical Center, which is an outstanding facility. And I was able to increase my lung capacity through yoga and meditation. So I'm not as reliant on medications for COPD as I otherwise would be. And he documented that. I have several mental health diagnoses. I was dependent on medications for anxiety. I no longer am. And it was interesting because as I became medication free for anxiety medications, I developed hypomania. And the way my psychiatrist and I decided to understand that was that I was interpreting my body responses differently.
Oh, interesting. So you had to kind of relearn how to interpret your body responses now that you were off the anxiety medication.
Yeah, and I became like very irritable and like speedy. You know, I became Mr. Speedo. I was speeding around. And because, you know, if you think about it, anxiety and hypomania are both adrenaline responses. And so...
so you were on the benzodiazepines or something for this?
Yeah, for anxiety, I was on benzodiazepines, which slow you down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then, after I became... I mean, I don't really experience anxiety anymore. And I used to have debilitating panic attacks. And I used to have also social phobias, and I don't really have either one anymore.
You don't experience anxiety anymore? Like you just don't experience anxiety?
Not much. I mean, a little bit, but not. I don't have panic attacks. No, and I used to have terrible ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked with that through a lot of internal work, and a lot of meditation, and a lot of therapy, internal. And I do a lot of my own analysis, and then I kind of tell my therapist what I've done. And he works with me. And I also have a therapist who does psychotherapy with somebody with schizophrenia, which is very rare, because usually therapy for somebody with schizophrenia means hand-holding. It's called supportive therapy. They usually won't do in-depth psychotherapy.
Yeah, there was actually a big story in the New York Times Magazine recently about working with people who hear voices and the importance of psychological therapy kinds of approaches, and it definitely is helpful to a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah,
actually, that's something that Peter does, and I'm sure is involved in decreasing the role of medications. Well, my therapist works in depth with me psychotherapeutically. So then I became in order to not drive the people around me crazy, and with my irritability and my hypomania, I decided to use mood stabilizers. Well, my wife noticed that mood stabilizers were causing memory problems, and so I began working with... I noticed a strong connection between hypomania. I observed, having studied a lot of meditation and Zen and insight, especially insight meditation, which is Southeast Asian. And now Zen. I watched the conditions under which thoughts and feelings arise, and the conditions under which thoughts and feelings fall away. And I noticed the conditions under which hypomania would arise, and then I would notice the conditions under which they fall away. So I gave up television because television is a very angry media. When I got off television, I was able also to get off mood stabilizers and use them PRN. So I work with my psychiatrist in these kinds of ways, and he's also a meditator, and so I'm able to work with him on these kinds of issues, and in spiritual ways, and with psychotherapy.
Yeah, and I find that also that the internet can definitely be a trigger. If I've been surfing for a while or doing my email for a while, I can get very dissociated, and that can lead to a lot of problems. It can be a real trigger.
Actually, if I sit at work working on my computer, I can dissociate.
Yeah.
I'm not even surfing the net, just
sitting there
on the computer screen.
Yeah, actually, I just recently, this is a tip for anybody who's listening, I figured out how to turn my computer into black and white, so there's no colors on my computer.
Oh, really?
And it really helps.
How do you do that? Because that might help me.
It's actually if you go to it's often in the universal access settings, like for helping people who have visual impairments, use the computer, then you can choose grayscale instead of, and then change the contrast. So I've been telling people, hey, try a black and white computer, see what happens.
I'm going to try that because that may help me.
It's worth trying. It's all about, experimenting and seeing what works for you. You mentioned before, and we were talking earlier about just the whole question of suicide. And I think that this is it's an important question because it's often at the core of why these states are scary, because we think, okay, the person is going off the deep end. They're going to die. They're going to be in a manic state and think that they can fly their car into a tree, which my friend Oryx thought that he could do, or they're going to get so depressed that they're going to jump off a building or cut themselves. And then on the other side of it is that the system uses the fear of suicide as an opportunity and an explanation for why force is important. Okay, you're going to commit suicide. You're suicidal. Therefore, we have to put you in restraints. We have to lock you up. We have to put you in the hospital for your own good. So I'm just wondering, what are the kind of things that you've learned about that from your own experience and also from the efforts that you're making to transform the mental health system?
I think one of the problems is that with with suicide is hopelessness, obviously, and that we need conditions and we need places where hopefulness springs forth, and right now, mental health systems only in spots are places where hope springs forth. We have some data from New York that the strategies that people use for coping with suicidal thoughts are not the mental health system. The mental health system ranks number 10 in what people use for coping with suicidal thoughts. Talking and companionship, talking with families, friends, and peers ranks number 1.
And it's always been very difficult for me to understand why, for example, people's cell phones are taken away from them when they go into the hospitals, why it's so hard to make phone calls, why the visiting hours are limited. There's often shared public phones. People don't have any privacy. It seems like going into the hospital often cuts you off from the support networks that you need to help you deal as a coping mechanism for suicidal thoughts and feelings.
Well, in many places, if you call in as a voluntary patient to 911 or to a hotline and say that you're suicidal voluntarily, you'll hear a knock at the door, sirens. You'll be locked in handcuffs, thrown in the back of a police car, and taken to a lockup. None of which is hopeful. None of which is what you need when you're suicidal.
Yeah, none of which is going to happen if you come to a Freedom Center support group. People come all the time and talk about suicide, and we don't ever do anything like that.
Well, in some focus groups we've done, also we found out on the issue of why don't people talk with mental health professionals about suicide. We have found out that to talk about the professional side for a minute, that consumer survivors are relieved to be able to use the word suicide, and professionals have so much consequentiality connected with their positions, so much liability connected with their positions that they become afraid to use the term suicide with consumer survivors because they're afraid to trigger suicide. And when we talk with consumer survivors in focus groups, they say, "Gee, it's nice to use the term suicide."
Yeah,
to
be able to be open about it. I mean, one thing that I have learned is that it's often, if someone does start talking about suicide and their suicidal feelings, that it's really important to listen to them, but also to realize that you don't necessarily have to focus on that. It doesn't have to be the sole topic of the conversation. There may be lots of other things that they want to talk about as well, because I think that if you do focus on it exclusively, then the fear of the listener starts to become an ingredient of like, why are you so interested in my suicidal issues, kind of.
Yeah. So the reason that we found out in the focus groups that people don't talk about suicide with professionals, the main reason is the consequentiality issue viewed from the point of view of consumer survivors. They will end up locked up, or they will have their medication taken away and have it doled out by professionals, or there will be some other consequence. They'll be viewed differently from then on. There's consequences to talking about suicide, and people fear those consequences. I think that the issue of force has become so identified with the mental health system that people don't want to use the mental health system. There's several studies which show that. Of course, there's a wellness study done in California a number of years ago by Gene Campbell. There's another study done in Europe which shows people don't use services where there's outpatient commitment. And then there's the studies we've been doing on suicide and why people don't talk about suicide or use professional services much when they have suicidal thoughts.
I think it's also true of homeless shelters and domestic violence services, that people are afraid of using those services and then, being forced into the system when they talk about what's going on with them, whether it's suicide or cutting or depression or whatever experience that they're having. It's like force drives people away from getting help.
Well, yeah, I know from my experience in the streets, and I was just in Los Angeles working with the Los Angeles Men's Project, which is it's a homeless project in downtown Los Angeles. The number of people who raised their hands when I was training professionals who are about 30% of them were ex-street people, but I was training professionals who deal on a daily basis with the situations created by the homelessness in Los Angeles, and they were saying when I asked that a lot of people are there because they're running away from systems that they don't want to be forced into, and I think that question is not studied on purpose. I think NIMH avoids studying a lot of questions. I think NIMH actually is dominated by what I'd call the monkey brain syndrome, that we all kind of function like monkey brains, and they can't get out of that syndrome. They can't get back to reality, the reality of when things arise and when things fall away, of accurate observation outside of their limited paradigm of the genome and the brain. And how long have we been looking at the genome and have yet to make discoveries related to mental illness? It's been quite a while.
Right. Even there's not even a definition of what consciousness is. They haven't discovered where consciousness is in the brain. Well, it's interesting that you're bringing it back to spirituality. We haven't got a lot more time, and this has been really, really fascinating. And I just wanted to, bring up again the spirituality question, and if you had more thoughts about that, and especially like what is the possible role that spirituality can play in the mental health system when, not everybody has the same religious orientation, or some people aren't interested in spirituality at all, or they haven't really learned much about it. What sort of role do you think it has to play?
To me, spirituality is, its most simple definition is non-separation. That if you take a simple analogy, that human beings are one body, and that if my left hand, say my left hand's called Joe and my right hand's called Jim, if my left hand is cut and starts to bleed. Jim, my right hand, just immediately goes over and helps Joe, my left hand. On the other hand, if I feel separate, then Jim, my right hand, looks over at Joe and says, "Oh, I'm not going to help you." Then the whole body dies. And I think when we have that realization, that's what spirituality is.
I like that. Ed Knight, do you have any closing thoughts or ideas as we wind down the interview here?
Yeah, I think there's hope everywhere all the time, and I think that there's basically a way of working with every situation, and there's resources to be found in every situation, even when we don't think we have any. And the supreme feast, which is life at every moment, is to be found, no matter how little we think we have.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to an interview with Ed Knight. Ed is a leader in the movement to transform the mental health system from a recovery perspective. Ed works with Valueoptions Behavioral Care. You can contact him through their website, valueoptions.com. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.